The American frontier was a land of opportunity, but it was also a land drenched in blood. In the 1870s, New Mexico Territory was a raw, restless place where fortunes could be made overnight and lives could be snuffed out just as quickly. The law was supposed to bring order to the chaos, but often the law itself was corrupted by money, power, and greed. And in the small town of Lincoln, a storm was brewing that would explode into one of the most violent conflicts in the history of the Wild West. At the heart of this storm stood two men, destined to clash in a way that would change the American frontier forever. On one side was Sheriff William Brady, a lawman in name, but in truth the hired protector of a wealthy monopoly that squeezed local ranchers and merchants dry. Brady wielded his badge like a weapon, using his deputies not for justice but for intimidation, profit, and blood. On the other side stood a young gunslinger, barely more than a boy, who had drifted into Lincoln County with nothing but a quick hand and an unshakable sense of loyalty. His name was Henry McCarty, but history would remember him by another name, Billy the Kid. He wasn't born an outlaw. He wasn't raised a killer. But the murder of the man who had taken him in, given him work, and treated him with respect would ignite a fire in Billy that turned him into a legend of vengeance. This is the story of betrayal, revenge, and lawless justice. The story of how a corrupt sheriff and a teenage gunslinger became locked in a blood feud that set Lincoln County ablaze. And it begins with a single gunshot that echoed through the desert, the shot that killed John Tunstall. The year was 1878, and Lincoln County was not simply a quiet frontier town. It was a battlefield disguised as a community. Behind the wooden storefronts and dusty saloons, two powerful factions were waging a silent war for money and control. On one side stood the Murphy-Dolan faction, Irish merchants who ran the town like their personal kingdom. They owned the only general store, controlled the lucrative cattle trade, and held sway over the courts and the law itself. Their ally was none other than Sheriff William Brady, who carried the authority of the badge but acted as their enforcer. On the other side rose a challenger, John Tunstall, a young English rancher, refined, ambitious, and determined to carve out a fair business against the Murphy-Dolan monopoly. With his partner, lawyer Alexander McSween, Tunstall opened a rival store and brought competition to a town that had never known it. But competition in Lincoln County was not settled with business deals. It was settled with guns. Sheriff Brady made his allegiance clear. Instead of protecting fairness, he turned his deputies into hired muscle for the Murphy-Dolan faction. They harassed Tunstall's men, seized property, and made it known that no one in Lincoln should dare oppose the sheriff's friends. For Billy the Kid, who had found work on Tunstall's ranch, this loyalty mattered. Tunstall treated him like more than a hired hand, he treated him like family. And then came the moment that shattered everything. On February 18, 1878, Sheriff Brady's deputies ambushed John Tunstall as he rode across the open range. They gunned him down without mercy, leaving his body in the dust as a warning to anyone who would dare defy Murphy, Dolan, or Brady. For most men, such a killing meant fear, silence, and obedience. But for Billy the Kid, it meant something very different. It meant war. The murder of John Tunstall ignited a fire that could not be contained. For Billy the Kid, Tunstall's death was not just the loss of an employer. It was the loss of a man who had treated him with dignity in a world that had offered him nothing but hardship. Standing over Tunstall's lifeless body, Billy made a vow that would echo across the frontier. He would kill every man responsible for the ambush. Billy was not alone. Other young ranch hands and loyal allies rallied to his side. They called themselves the Regulators, and they swore an oath of vengeance. No longer would they rely on courts or sheriffs. The law was corrupt, the badge itself a symbol of tyranny. Justice, they believed, would come from the barrel of a gun. The Regulators struck fast. Deputies who had pulled the trigger on Tunstall were hunted down and executed in the open. Fear spread across Lincoln County as the regulators delivered their own brand of justice. But for Billy, the war would not be complete until Sheriff William Brady himself paid the price. Brady had not fired the fatal shot, but in Billy's eyes, the sheriff's badge had shielded the killers, and his loyalty to Murphy and Dolan had made the ambush possible. On the morning of April 1, 1878, the regulators made their move. Brady, walking down the main street of Lincoln with 4 of his deputies, believed himself untouchable. The sun was rising, the town was quiet, and the sheriff's stride was confident. But as he passed a row of adobe buildings, gun barrels glinted in the shadows. Billy the Kid and his regulators opened fire in broad daylight. A storm of bullets ripped through the street. Brady staggered, struck multiple times, collapsing into the dust. The sheriff who had once ruled Lincoln with power and fear lay dead, his badge glinting in the sun, soaked in blood. The people of Lincoln gasped. The sheriff had been executed like an outlaw, and in that moment the line between lawman and criminal was erased. Billy the Kid had declared war not only on Brady, but on the very system of power that had betrayed him. The assassination of Sheriff William Brady sent shockwaves across the New Mexico territory. To some, it was justice, a corrupt lawman cut down by the very violence he had sanctioned. To others, it was a crime against order, proof that Billy the Kid and his regulators were nothing more than bloodthirsty killers. But no matter how it was seen, one truth was undeniable. Lincoln County had become a war zone. Brady's death unleashed a spiral of retribution. The Murphy-Dolan faction, now enraged, mobilized their gunmen. The regulators struck back, ambushing enemies, burning property, and leaving bodies across the desert trails. Lincoln, once a sleepy frontier town, became a battlefield where every corner could hide a rifle barrel, every alley could echo with gunfire. The violence reached its climax in July of 1878, during what became known as the 5-Day Battle. Murphy-Dolan gunmen surrounded the house of Alexander McSween, trapping Billy the Kid and the regulators inside. For days, bullets shredded walls and whistled through windows as the town cowered in terror. Then, on the 5th night, the attackers set the house ablaze. Flames swallowed the building, smoke filled the sky, and chaos reigned as men tried to flee. McSween was gunned down, his body riddled with bullets, while Billy the Kid fought his way through the fire, escaping into the darkness. The Lincoln County War left the town scarred and its people broken. The power of Murphy and Dolan survived, but their grip was weakened. Sheriff Brady's badge, once a symbol of authority, became a relic of corruption. And Billy the Kid, outlaw, avenger, legend, rode out of Lincoln not as a hired hand, but as a figure who would haunt the American frontier forever. Was he a hero fighting for justice in a land without law, or a ruthless killer who used vengeance as an excuse for bloodshed? History still argues the answer. Sheriff William Brady was more than just a lawman. He was the iron fist of Lincoln County's corruption. Born in Ireland, Brady came to America as a soldier before settling in New Mexico. By the 1870s, he had risen to the position of county sheriff, a role that gave him authority over one of the largest territories in the West. But instead of protecting justice, Brady turned the power of his badge into a tool for greed. Brady aligned himself with the Murphy-Dolan faction, the wealthy merchants who dominated Lincoln's trade. For them, Brady was not simply a sheriff, he was their enforcer. Deputies under his command seized livestock from rivals, intimidated ranchers into obedience, and ensured that no competitor could rise against Murphy and Dolan's monopoly. Brady's loyalty was not to the people of Lincoln County, but to the businessmen who lined his pockets. To ordinary citizens, Brady represented everything wrong with frontier law. He wasn't the kind of sheriff who rode into town to save the day. He was the kind who walked into a saloon, demanded silence, and made sure everyone knew which side of the law held the real power. With his influence, Murphy and Dolan didn't just control the county's economy, they controlled its justice system too. And when blood was spilled, Brady made sure it was his enemies who paid the price, while his allies walked free. Brady's corruption would make him one of the most hated men in Lincoln. Yet he wore his badge proudly, believing himself untouchable. That illusion would soon shatter. John Henry Tunstall was not born of the desert or the cattle trails. He was an outsider, a young Englishman from a prosperous family who came to the New Mexico territory in search of opportunity. Unlike the hardened ranchers and merchants who carved their fortunes from dust and blood, Tunstall carried with him the manners of a gentleman. He was ambitious, educated, and determined to succeed, but more importantly, he believed in fair business and fair treatment. In Lincoln County, he saw a chance to break the monopoly of Murphy-Dolan. Where others sold goods at outrageous prices and used violence to crush rivals, Tunstall envisioned a store and a ranch built on honest trade. He offered lower prices, treated his employees with dignity, and refused to bow to the corruption that ruled the county. His partnership with lawyer Alexander McSween gave him both financial strength and legal standing, making him a real threat to the Murphy-Dolan empire. To the local townsfolk, Tunstall represented hope. He was young, handsome, and principled, everything his corrupt rivals were not. But those very qualities also painted a target on his back. Men like Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan thrived on intimidation. To them, Tunstall's defiance was not only competition, it was an insult. What made Tunstall truly unique on the frontier, however, was the way he treated those who worked for him. Where other ranch owners saw their cowhands as disposable tools, Tunstall valued loyalty and respect. He took a particular interest in one of his employees, a wiry young man with a quick draw and restless energy. That man was Henry McCarty, who the world would later call Billy the Kid. For Billy, Tunstall became more than an employer. He became a symbol of fairness in an unfair world. And when Tunstall's life was stolen in cold blood, it was Billy's loyalty that would ignite the flames of war. He was born Henry McCarty, though he carried many names in his short, violent life: William H. Bonney, Kid Antrim, and the one that would echo through history, Billy the Kid. Unlike Sheriff Brady or John Tunstall, Billy was not born into power, nor into wealth. He came from poverty, raised by a widowed mother who died when he was still a boy. Orphaned and rootless, Billy grew up in the alleys of the frontier, surviving through wit, charm, and an uncanny ability to adapt. By his teens, Billy had already been on both sides of the law. He worked as a ranch hand, a gambler, and occasionally as a thief. But those who knew him described a young man with a quick smile, a sharp sense of humor, and a natural magnetism. He wasn't the cold-blooded killer that legends later painted. He was a boy searching for belonging in a world that gave him little but hardship. His skill with a gun, however, made him stand out. Fast, fearless, and deadly accurate, Billy was the kind of man people either followed or feared. When Billy found work on John Tunstall's ranch, something changed. For the first time, he was treated as more than just another drifting hand. Tunstall gave him responsibility, trust, and a sense of family. That bond became the foundation of Billy's loyalty. To him, Tunstall wasn't just an employer, he was a friend, perhaps even a father figure. So when Sheriff Brady's deputies ambushed and murdered Tunstall, Billy's life took a dark turn. The boy who had sought a place in the world became the young outlaw who would declare war on corruption. He swore vengeance not only on the killers themselves, but on the system that allowed it, the system Sheriff William Brady represented. Billy the Kid would rise from the dust of Lincoln County not as a nameless ranch hand, but as a legend born in blood. 3 men, 3 very different paths, and 1 county destined to erupt in violence. Sheriff William Brady, the powerful lawman whose badge had become a shield for corruption, stood as the enforcer of the Murphy-Dolan monopoly. John Tunstall, the principled young English rancher, dared to challenge that empire with honesty and fairness. And caught between them was Billy the Kid, an orphan drifter whose loyalty to Tunstall would transform him from a ranch hand into an outlaw legend. Their stories could not coexist peacefully. Brady's loyalty to Murphy and Dolan demanded that Tunstall be crushed. Tunstall's belief in fair trade demanded that he resist. Billy's need for belonging demanded that he fight for the man who had given him respect. The collision was inevitable, and when it came, it would leave Lincoln County scarred forever. In many ways, these three men embodied the very contradictions of the American frontier. Brady represented the dark side of authority, how law could be twisted into tyranny. Tunstall represented the hope of progress, how ideals of fairness could challenge entrenched power. And Billy the Kid represented the restless spirit of the West itself. Young, unpredictable, dangerous, and unforgettable. When their lives intersected in 1878, the result was not compromise but bloodshed. One would be murdered in cold blood. One would be ambushed and left riddled with bullets. And one would ride into history as the most infamous outlaw of the Wild West. The Lincoln County War was not just a feud between ranchers or a quarrel over business. It was the clash of these three figures, law, fairness, and vengeance, colliding in a land where justice was written in gun smoke. By early 1878, Lincoln County was a powder keg. On the surface, the town carried on with its usual rhythm. Merchants selling goods, ranchers driving cattle, saloons buzzing with whiskey and gambling. But beneath it all was a tension so sharp it could be felt in every whispered conversation and every cautious glance exchanged on the streets. Two factions, Murphy-Dolan and Tunstall McSween, had drawn their lines in the sand. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the conflict turned violent. Sheriff William Brady had already made his choice. His deputies were not neutral peacekeepers. They were hired muscle for Murphy and Dolan. When Brady's men rode out, it wasn't to protect the people of Lincoln County. It was to enforce the monopoly's will. To challenge Murphy and Dolan meant inviting the wrath of the sheriff's badge and the guns behind it. John Tunstall, however, was not a man easily intimidated. His store was thriving, his ranch growing, and his presence gave the townsfolk a glimpse of what life might look like without Murphy-Dolan's iron grip. But every step forward he took only deepened the hatred of his enemies. They saw him not as a rival businessman but as a threat to their empire. And in Lincoln County, threats were not tolerated, they were eliminated. Billy the Kid, working for Tunstall at the time, could sense the storm gathering. To him, Brady's deputies were more than lawmen. They were predators circling their prey. Billy's instincts, sharp and restless, told him that something was coming. He didn't know when or how, but he knew that Lincoln County was about to explode. And when it did, he would be caught in the middle. On the morning of February 18, 1878, John Tunstall saddled his horse and rode out with a small group of his men. The air was cool, the sky vast and open, and the desert stretched endlessly around them. It should have been a routine ride, the kind ranchers made every day. But unseen eyes were watching. Sheriff Brady's deputies, loyal to Murphy and Dolan, had been waiting for this moment. Among them were men like Jesse Evans and members of the so-called Jesse Evans Gang, outlaws who carried deputy badges but acted as mercenaries. To them, Tunstall was more than just a rancher. He was the obstacle keeping their employers from absolute control of Lincoln County. And on that morning, they decided to remove that obstacle. As Tunstall rode ahead, the ambush was sprung. Gunfire cracked across the plains, the sound echoing like thunder against the emptiness of the land. Horses screamed, dust exploded into the air, and chaos broke loose. Tunstall's companions scattered for cover, but he was caught in the open, a clear target against the horizon. Bullets tore through the silence. One struck him down and then another. Witnesses later said Tunstall never had a chance to draw his gun. He fell from his horse, clutching at the ground, before a final shot ended his life. His killers stood over him as he lay still in the dirt, his lifeless eyes staring up at the New Mexico sky. The message was clear. His death was not simply an accident or the result of a drunken quarrel. It was an execution, carried out under the authority of Sheriff Brady's badge. By murdering Tunstall, the Murphy-Dolan faction had sent a warning. No man, no matter how wealthy or respected, could defy their rule. But what they did not realize in that moment was that John Tunstall's blood would not wash away quietly into the dust. Instead, it would ignite a fire that would sweep across Lincoln County, and Billy the Kid would be its spark. When the news of John Tunstall's murder reached his ranch hands, it struck like a thunderclap. But for one young man, it was more than grief, it was fury. Henry McCarty, already known by some as Billy the Kid, had lost more than an employer. He had lost the first man who ever treated him with dignity and trust. In a world that had taken everything from him, his parents, his childhood, his security, Tunstall had given him a place to belong. Now that place had been ripped away in a spray of bullets. Billy rode to where Tunstall's body lay. The Englishman was sprawled in the dirt, lifeless eyes fixed on the sky, his blood soaking into the desert dust. The sight seared itself into Billy's memory. He dismounted, knelt beside the man, and swore aloud that those responsible would pay. His words were not empty threats. They were a vow that would shape the course of his life. "I'll kill every man who had a hand in it," he said, his voice low but deadly certain. Others might have cowered in fear, knowing that Brady's deputies held the law in their favor. But Billy saw the truth. The law was already dead. Brady's badge, instead of standing for justice, had sanctioned murder. If the law could not deliver justice, then Billy would take it into his own hands. He was not alone. Tunstall's other loyal men, angry, heartbroken, and betrayed, rallied around Billy. Together, they formed a group that history would remember as the Regulators. Their mission was simple: avenge Tunstall's death and punish every man who had taken part in it. But this oath would not stop at vengeance. In taking up arms against Brady's deputies, Billy and the Regulators would challenge the entire system that ruled Lincoln County. What began as grief was about to become war. The death of John Tunstall was not the end of a life. It was the beginning of a war. Outrage spread across Lincoln County as word traveled that a respected rancher had been murdered under the watch of Sheriff Brady. To the Murphy-Dolan faction, the ambush was a warning to all rivals. But to Tunstall's loyal men, it was a call to arms. From grief and anger, a brotherhood was born: the Regulators. These were not polished soldiers or lawmen bound by formal oaths. They were ranch hands, drifters, and young fighters, united by loyalty to the man who had given them a chance. And at their heart was Billy the Kid, his eyes burning with vengeance, his pistols ready to carry out the justice the courts would never deliver. The Regulators vowed to bring Tunstall's killers to justice, but justice in Lincoln County no longer meant trials or juries. It meant ambushes, shootouts, and executions carried out on dusty trails. Each member carried a rifle, each man knew the risks, and each was ready to kill or be killed. Their formation was both a rebellion and a revolution, an armed defiance against the sheriff, his deputies, and the empire they protected. The first blood was yet to come, but already the lines were drawn. Sheriff Brady represented the law, twisted and corrupted. Murphy and Dolan represented power, greedy and unyielding. And Billy the Kid, with the Regulators at his side, represented vengeance. The ambush of Tunstall had lit the fuse. The Regulators were the flame. And soon, Lincoln County would erupt in gunfire. As friends turned to enemies, lawmen became outlaws, and a young gunslinger named Billy the Kid began his transformation into legend. Lincoln County was no longer just a frontier settlement. It had become a battlefield. After the murder of John Tunstall, the fragile peace shattered completely. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Every saloon conversation dripped with fear, and every rider on the horizon could mean death. The Murphy-Dolan faction tightened their grip, using Sheriff Brady and his deputies to terrorize rivals. But Billy the Kid and the regulators struck back, answering bullets with bullets. The regulators were not content with words or empty threats. They began targeting those directly responsible for Tunstall's death. Deputies loyal to Brady, who had once swaggered through town with the security of a badge, now found themselves hunted. Ambushes erupted on lonely trails, and men were dragged from their saddles to face swift, merciless justice. Each time a deputy fell, whispers spread that Billy the Kid's hand had pulled the trigger. Whether true or not, his reputation grew darker and more dangerous. For the people of Lincoln, the line between lawman and outlaw was blurring. Brady still wore the star of authority, but his deputies acted as mercenaries, executing the will of Murphy and Dolan. The regulators claimed to fight for justice, but their justice came at the end of a rifle. In truth, Lincoln County had no law anymore, only sides, and as each body hit the ground, one truth became clearer. This war could only end when either Brady or Billy the Kid was gone. Billy the Kid and the regulators wasted no time. The deputies who had murdered John Tunstall were now their primary targets. These men had once walked the streets of Lincoln with impunity, armed with the authority of a sheriff's badge. But in the open desert, away from the courthouse and saloons, they were vulnerable. The regulators moved like shadows, striking with precision, leaving the guilty to face retribution they could not escape. The first killings were swift and brutal. Jesse Evans and his gang, known allies of Brady, found themselves under constant threat. Ambushes at isolated ranches and open trails became the regulators' signature tactic. Each engagement was meticulously planned. Each shot fired carried the weight of vengeance for Tunstall. The message was unmistakable. Justice would be delivered, but only by those willing to take it themselves. Billy the Kid's leadership emerged during this phase. Though young, he displayed a mix of cunning, fearlessness, and charisma that inspired the regulators to act decisively. He understood the psychology of terror in a lawless land. Fear could be as powerful a weapon as gunpowder. Every successful attack against Brady's deputies made the sheriff's position less secure and his authority less respected. The county itself began to fracture. Ordinary townsfolk, caught in the crossfire, watched as allegiances shifted. Some secretly aided the regulators, hoping for a return to fairness and protection under Tunstall's vision. Others clung to Brady and Murphy-Dolan, fearing the wrath of the regulators if they were caught siding with the opposition. The hunt for Brady's men was no longer a personal vendetta. It had become a war for the soul of Lincoln County. The tension escalated with each passing day, inching inexorably toward the inevitable showdown between Billy the Kid and Sheriff William Brady himself. April 1, 1878, dawned bright and clear over Lincoln County, but the serenity of the morning belied the storm about to erupt. Sheriff William Brady, confident in his authority and his deputies, walked the streets as if nothing could touch him. To the townspeople, he appeared untouchable, the enforcer of Murphy and Dolan, the man whose badge was law. But for Billy the Kid and the regulators, this day was the culmination of weeks of planning, the day when justice for Tunstall would finally be delivered. Brady and 4 of his deputies moved through the town, unaware that eyes in the shadows tracked every step. The regulators lay in wait, positioned with patience and precision. They had studied the sheriff's routines, observed his patrols, and knew exactly where to strike. It was not chaos, they had a plan, and the target was clear. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Bullets shattered the morning calm, ricocheting off wooden storefronts and dusty walls. Brady and his deputies scrambled for cover, but the regulators were relentless. In a matter of moments, the sheriff was struck multiple times. He stumbled, trying to retreat, but the desert dust claimed him. The sheriff who had once wielded power over Lincoln County lay dead in the street, his authority extinguished in a hail of gunfire. The townspeople watched in shock and awe. The law had been executed on its own enforcer. Billy the Kid had risen from a loyal ranch hand to a man whose reputation would spread across the frontier. The murder of Brady sent a clear message. The regulators were not to be underestimated. Lincoln County would never be the same. But while the victory was immediate, it also marked the escalation of a war that would engulf the town in fire, blood, and chaos for months to come. The death of Sheriff William Brady sent shockwaves through Lincoln County. For the Murphy-Dolan faction, it was a devastating blow, an affront to their power and a signal that the regulators would stop at nothing. For the townspeople, it was a stark revelation. The law was no longer a shield, but a weapon, wielded by men willing to take justice into their own hands. Billy the Kid, once a drifting teenager, had become the symbol of vengeance and rebellion. But the killing of Brady did not end the conflict. It escalated it. Murphy and Dolan quickly rallied more men, armed and ready to strike back. Ambushes, raids, and gunfights became commonplace as both factions fought not just for revenge, but for control of Lincoln County itself. Townsfolk were forced to choose sides. Allies became enemies, and the boundary between lawman and outlaw blurred entirely. Billy and the regulators continued their relentless campaign. Each victory against Brady's men increased their notoriety, but it also made them targets. The young gunslinger's name began to spread far beyond Lincoln, whispered in fear and awe from saloons to cattle trails. Every bullet fired, every deputy felled, added to the legend, but also to the mounting tension that threatened to consume the entire county. The assassination of Sheriff Brady was more than a single act of vengeance. It was the spark that ignited a full-scale war, a bloody saga that would leave Lincoln County scarred forever. And at the center of it all stood Billy the Kid, a boy who had taken the law into his own hands, and whose path was now inseparable from violence, notoriety, and the making of legend. By July 1878, Lincoln County was a powder keg on the verge of total explosion. The regulators, emboldened by the assassination of Sheriff Brady and the deaths of other deputies, had shifted from revenge to defensive operations. They took refuge in Alexander McSween's adobe house, the headquarters of the Tunstall-McSween faction. It was a stronghold but not impregnable. Across the streets, Murphy-Dolan gunmen gathered, determined to crush the opposition once and for all. The townspeople watched from the shadows as Lincoln transformed into a battlefield. Wooden buildings became cover, alleyways became ambush points, and the streets were lined with men ready to kill or be killed. For 5 straight days, gunfire rattled through the town, smoke filled the sky, and the desert air rang with echoes of violence. Ordinary life was suspended. Survival became the only goal. Billy the Kid and the regulators fought relentlessly, moving from window to window, firing upon the enemy while defending McSween's stronghold. Each day brought escalating casualties. Murphy-Dolan forces, well-armed and determined, surrounded the house, cutting off any hope of escape. The regulators were trapped in a siege where every move could be fatal. Yet Billy's daring and strategic instincts kept them alive, earning him a reputation as both fearless and cunning. The streets of Lincoln became a war zone. Fires ignited by stray bullets or deliberate arson engulfed parts of the town. Civilians fled, buildings burned, and the desert dust mixed with smoke and blood. By the 3rd day, it was clear that this battle would not end in negotiation. It would end in death. By the 4th day of the siege, tensions had reached a breaking point. The Murphy-Dolan forces, frustrated by the regulators' stubborn defense, resorted to a brutal tactic: fire. Torches and blazing rags were thrown against the adobe walls of Alexander McSween's house, setting the structure alight. Smoke poured into the streets, curling over the town like a warning of impending doom. Inside, the regulators scrambled to hold their positions, firing through windows, ducking under beams, and dodging flames that threatened to consume them alive. Billy the Kid, with his quick reflexes and sharp aim, became the focal point of the defenders' strategy. Moving from window to window, he picked off attackers, covering retreats and rallying the men around him. Yet the fire was relentless. Adobe walls cracked under the heat, beams threatened to collapse, and the thick smoke made every breath a struggle. The regulators were trapped not only by bullets but by the flames surrounding them. Alexander McSween himself became a symbol of the siege's desperation. A lawyer by trade, a businessman by ambition, he had led his faction into a war he had hoped to avoid. Now, facing the inferno consuming his home, he fought alongside his men, determined to die with dignity rather than surrender. Civilians, hiding in nearby buildings or fleeing the town, watched in horror as Lincoln's streets erupted into chaos, smoke and fire mixing with the acrid stench of gunpowder. By the end of the day, the house was fully ablaze. Men who survived the initial assault were forced into open combat, facing a barrage of gunfire from the surrounding enemy. McSween's death was imminent, and the regulators' position had become untenable. Lincoln County itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing that the climax of this 5-day nightmare was near. As the flames engulfed the adobe house, the final moments of the Lincoln County siege approached. Alexander McSween, the man whose courage and ambition had fueled the Tunstall-McSween faction, faced his destiny with grim resolve. Surrounded, trapped, and outnumbered, McSween knew that escape was impossible. Every moment in the burning building brought him closer to death, yet he refused to surrender to the Murphy-Dolan forces that had hunted him and his allies relentlessly. The regulators fought desperately around him. Billy the Kid, alongside his companions, returned fire from windows, doorways, and any position that offered cover. Smoke and heat clawed at their lungs, while bullets tore through the adobe walls. Each second became a battle for survival, but the numerical advantage and sheer determination of Murphy-Dolan's gunmen eventually tipped the scales. Finally, McSween stepped into the open, perhaps hoping to negotiate, perhaps realizing his life was ending. In a storm of bullets, he was struck down, murdered in the very streets of Lincoln that had once been his home. His body, riddled with gunfire, became a symbol of the regulators' devastating defeat. With McSween gone, the leadership of the Tunstall-McSween faction collapsed. The regulators, though still led by Billy the Kid, were forced into retreat. Lincoln County had been reduced to a battlefield of fire, blood, and smoke. Homes were destroyed, streets were littered with debris and bodies, and the survivors, both combatants and civilians, were left to reckon with the cost of vengeance. The 5-day battle had ended, but its consequences would echo through the territory for years to come. Billy the Kid emerged from the chaos, scarred but alive, his reputation cemented as both a ruthless avenger and a cunning survivor of the frontier's most violent confrontation. As the smoke cleared and Lincoln County lay in ruins, Billy the Kid slipped through the chaos, narrowly escaping the wrath of the Murphy-Dolan gunmen. The young gunslinger, once a drifting teenager, now carried the weight of legend. He had survived a 5-day siege, seen allies fall, and witnessed the brutal death of Alexander McSween. Yet he remained alive, and with that survival came notoriety that would spread far beyond the desert trails of New Mexico. The 5-day battle marked the transformation of Billy from a loyal ranch hand into an outlaw of near-mythical status. He had seen firsthand the limits of law in the frontier. Sheriff Brady had been dead, justice had been bought and sold, and men like Murphy and Dolan ruled by fear. In this world, survival required cunning, speed, and unflinching ruthlessness. Billy possessed all three. His escape was not simply a flight from danger. It was the beginning of a reign of infamy. Stories of his daring and deadly skill traveled quickly, carried by whispers, letters, and tales in saloons across the territory. Some called him a hero of vengeance, others a cold-blooded killer. To Lincoln County, he was a symbol of what happened when law and order failed, a reminder that the frontier could be as dangerous as it was free. The town of Lincoln would slowly rebuild, but the scars of the war remained. Families mourned, businesses were lost, and the psychological toll lingered. Billy the Kid, meanwhile, continued his path through the Wild West, forever tied to the events of those 5 fateful days. The siege had ended, but the legend of Billy the Kid, shaped by vengeance, survival, and a relentless frontier spirit, had only just begun. When the smoke cleared over Lincoln County, the town was unrecognizable. Buildings were burned, streets were littered with debris, and the air still carried the acrid scent of gunpowder and smoke. Families mourned lost loved ones, merchants counted ruined inventories, and the townspeople realized the full cost of a conflict fueled by greed and vengeance. The Tunstall-McSween faction was shattered. Murphy and Dolan had cemented their dominance, and the regulators had fled, leaving behind a landscape of devastation. For the people of Lincoln, the war had been more than a power struggle. It had been a terrifying lesson in the fragility of law and order on the frontier. Sheriff Brady's death, McSween's assassination, and the blood-soaked streets demonstrated that loyalty, courage, and fairness offered no protection against greed and violence. The town's wounds would take years to heal, and the shadow of the Lincoln County War would linger over the community, shaping the way generations remembered the frontier. Billy the Kid, now an outlaw of legend, had survived the chaos. But the battle had transformed him forever. The young gunslinger was no longer just a loyal ranch hand. He was a man defined by vengeance, skill, and a willingness to defy authority. His escape from Lincoln marked the beginning of a career that would make him one of the most infamous figures in the American West. News of Billy the Kid's exploits spread quickly across the New Mexico territory and beyond. Stories of the teenage gunslinger who had survived ambushes, killed men with deadly precision, and eluded the law-captured imaginations. Some whispered that he was a hero avenging a murdered mentor. Others insisted he was a ruthless killer, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. The regulators, though scattered, carried the memory of Tunstall and McSween's deaths with them. The Lincoln County War had forged bonds of loyalty and enmity alike, and those who had survived became part of a narrative that blurred the lines between justice and revenge. Newspapers printed sensational accounts, and the frontier was abuzz with tales of gunfights, narrow escapes, and relentless pursuit. Billy's name became synonymous with both defiance and danger, a figure who embodied the lawlessness and unpredictability of the American West. Lincoln County itself had learned a harsh truth. When lawmen serve only the powerful, ordinary people are left to fend for themselves. The war had exposed the fragility of justice, the corruption of authority, and the violent extremes to which men would go for revenge. Though the regulators had been defeated in Lincoln, the conflict did not end entirely. Murphy and Dolan's faction remained dominant, but their hold on the county was no longer absolute. Rivalries simmered, alliances shifted, and the specter of revenge lingered over the desert trails. Survivors of the war took refuge elsewhere, planning, scheming, or fleeing from those who sought retribution. Billy the Kid, now on the run, became both a symbol of fear and inspiration. His daring escape, skill with firearms, and survival against overwhelming odds turned him into a living legend. He was young, fearless, and unpredictable, a man who could vanish as quickly as he struck. Authorities and outlaws alike knew his name, and his path forward was now a mixture of vengeance, survival, and notoriety. Meanwhile, Lincoln County slowly tried to rebuild. Business resumed, houses were reconstructed, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet the memory of bloodshed, betrayal, and loss haunted the town. Every street corner, every scorched building, was a reminder of how quickly lawlessness and greed could consume a community. The Lincoln County War left an indelible mark on history. It was not merely a feud between rival merchants or factions. It was a reflection of the lawlessness, corruption, and harsh realities of the American frontier. Sheriff Brady's corruption, Tunstall's idealism, and Billy the Kid's vengeance embodied the extremes of morality and survival in a land without strong governance. Billy the Kid emerged as the most enduring figure of the conflict. His legend would inspire books, ballads, and countless retellings of the Wild West. To some, he was a hero, a symbol of justice when the law failed. To others, he was a cold-blooded killer, a reminder of how vengeance could blur the line between right and wrong. Lincoln County itself became a cautionary tale. In a place where justice is bought, power is wielded by the corrupt, and violence is the currency of survival, even the smallest spark can ignite a war that changes everything. The events of 1878 shaped the frontier forever, leaving behind a legacy of blood, betrayal, and the story of a young gunslinger whose name would never be forgotten. Billy the Kid. The sun set over Lincoln County, painting the dust and ruins in shades of fire and gold. The streets that had echoed with gunfire were now silent. Houses were rebuilt, cattle resumed their slow march across the plains, and life tried to return to a fragile rhythm. Yet the scars of 1878 could never truly heal. The memories of bloodshed, betrayal, and vengeance lingered like smoke in the air, reminding everyone that the frontier was a land ruled by both opportunity and danger. Billy the Kid, young, fearless, and relentless, had survived what so many others had not. From a loyal hand on Tunstall's ranch, he had become a symbol of defiance and survival, a man whose name would echo across the West for generations. Sheriff Brady's corruption, Tunstall's idealism, and the relentless battles of the regulators had shaped him, forging a legend in fire and blood. Lincoln County itself became a story etched into the history of the American frontier, a tale of lawless ambition, merciless vengeance, and the fine line between justice and chaos. The war had ended, but its lessons remained. When authority is corrupted, when loyalty is tested, and when the powerless are left with no recourse, the frontier will write its own justice in gun smoke and dust. And so the saga closed not with a sense of peace, but with a legacy. A young gunslinger rode into legend. A town bore the memory of blood and fire, and history remembered the clash of men, ideals, and survival. The Lincoln County War was over, but the story of Billy the Kid, the boy who became a legend, was only just beginning.